Hello, hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
I couldn't think of a suitably widow intro from Kevin here this morning. So let's get on to the main meat of the episode. It's all about music and soundtracks because, Colin, we were going to do episode 2 of Trails in the Sky SE, chapter 2. But we realized chapter 1, there's not much there.
Yeah, there's not much there.
So next Sunday, you'll be seeing chapter 2 and chapter 3. And my good, chapter 3, there is so much.
Chapter 3, like we probably could have done chapter 3 on our own. The only reason why we're not just doing it now is because there was no way I was going to be able to get it done by this morning. But I'm looking forward to that discussion, like very, very much so.
You know what's also fantastic, Colin?
What?
Music, especially music in games.
So we've had some disagreements about soundtracks in the past, what they should do in a game, the quality of certain soundtracks. For example, when we were doing our Trails in the Sky FC retrospective, I, of course, waxed lyrical on the quality of the soundtrack, and Kevin said, fine, which is something that I will never understand.
To me, the Trails soundtrack is the epitome of video game soundtracks and how I approach them. It's fine. It helps set the mood. I can recognize scary dungeon theme, fancy schmancy theme, in the overworld fighting monster themes, but they're just in the background. They don't demand to be noted.
So I disagree with you on so many things about this. Because number one, I think there are a lot of songs in the Trails in the Sky FC/SC soundtrack that do demand that you listen to them. For example, chapter 2, we're fighting Walter. You lose to Walter. Then all of a sudden, Zin comes in. But right before he comes in to save us, you hear ba 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 ba. A challenger invited starts playing, blaring. Extreme contrast to like the somber tones that we had before. First time I heard that, I literally threw my controller down and started like pumping my fists in the air because it's just it filled me with pump, you know. And then Zin comes in and saves you, and it's great. It accentuates that moment. But that song definitely demands a response. I'm sorry, it does.
I mean, I'll say two things to that. One, I'm glad Zin came in because when we were faced with a boss fight that we defeated only for them to turn around and have a sudden power up, I was really scared because I was thinking, oh no, this has never happened before in the series and never will again. Gee, I sure hope someone comes in to save our bacon.
Okay, to be fair, with that fight, you are fighting one set of enemies, you win, and then Walter's like, now I can fight. It's not like certain boss fights in Trails of Cold Steel 2, where you fight them and then the game acts like you've actually lost.
Okay, so that snark aside, I do understand the distinction, but for the track in question, and we'll discuss, should we have any differences in how we approach or define a song versus a track? I mean, I heard it. It was fine, and I kept playing. There wasn't this connection or this forcing me out in a good way, forcing me out of the game and listening to it or contemplating the way that I do for a very few exceptional listings for music in games.
We were talking about this yesterday when we were planning out this episode, because I know that your opinion is that songs should be kind of fading in the background. You don't pay that much attention to it, yada, 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 because you don't want that soundtrack to take you out of the game. You don't want it to take away from the game because you want to focus on what you're doing. And to me, I don't understand that. And the reason why I don't understand that is that, like, for example, say I'm playing a turn-based RPG like Bug Fables.
Yeah.
Bug Fables has an amazing soundtrack, especially for its boss themes. And so I'm sitting there fighting, and then, yeah, there might be a moment in which I go like, damn, this song is awesome. And then you know what I do? I keep playing the game and I keep putting the beat down on that boss, or I make my strategy or whatever. Because as human beings, we are capable of thinking multiple things at once. The greatness of this song in particular serves to underpin the awesomeness of the moment as opposed to distracting you from the moment. At least that's how I experience it.
Okay, that implicit criticism of me aside, let's pose a question, Colin. Let's compare or contrast a bit to soundtracks and say movie, because I think there's some fruitful discussion to be had, how they're similar, how they're different. Let's take a film with an amazing soundtrack that we all agree is high quality, Lord of the Rings. Now, I can recognize various themes: Rohan, Gondor, the Fellowship, arias specific to the characters, and they complement the scenes. They add tension or pathos, or what say you, but they are secondary to what's going on screen. I think they are much more complex than what we generally see in video games. And that's not a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. And even in movies, I prefer the soundtrack to be subterranean. I'm not sure what to say it, but
Understated.
to not take me out. Yeah.
So I can't comment much on the Lord of the Rings example because, as I've said a couple of times on this show, I'm not that much of a Lord of the Rings fan. I don't know the soundtrack. However, one soundtrack from movies that we both know is Star Wars.
Yeah.
And Star Wars things like the Imperial March or the opening theme. I mean, these are iconic. I don't see like they do call out to be listened to, I think. I listened to them in the car before. They're also used time and time again in all forms of Star Wars media, video games,
Yeah.
TV shows, yada, yada. It creates an expectation. It creates a connection between you and the scene that you're watching. And in that case, I don't want it to be understated. Like the music is a core element.
So maybe I'm just being nonsensical here because I understand and agree with all those points about what the Imperial March does to the scenes it's in, especially the first time you hear it, the Tatooine theme with that soulful, desert-enthused qualities. I guess what I'm saying for like 90% or more of video games, I don't see anything of nearly that kind of quality. Maybe that's what I'm saying overall. I like movie soundtracks. I like really good movie soundtracks better than most of what we see in games.
I mean, that's a completely fair take to have. I mean, I listen to video game soundtracks. I don't listen to movie soundtracks. That's just my personal preference. I know that you're playing Final Fantasy VII Remake right now. Final Fantasy VII in general has, I think, one of the best soundtracks ever made, especially when it's re-engineered into an orchestral soundtrack. I would give that a listen.
And that's really interesting because that game came out in early 97. So it was made 96, 95.
Yeah.
That's, 25, 26 years old. I find that really fascinating, how something so old could have a soundtrack that is, from what you said, iconic and good, objectively good.
And the reason for it is that Nobuo Uematsu is a genius. He's a musical genius. Something, the Olympics were in Japan a couple of years ago, right? And they had this parade of like all of the nations coming in, and the host country sets the music for that. And what they decided to do was just do JRPG soundtracks. And it was fascinating to me because a lot of these songs originated on the NES. They originated on the Super Nintendo. These guys were just coding out little songs, bit bops and bloops, in order to give you something to listen to when you're playing the game. And they've now become like Japan's national music art form. Can you imagine like sitting there 30 years after making the first Final Fantasy soundtrack and realizing the impact that you've had? No, but like think of the original, the Final Fantasy original theme. Ba-da-da-da-da-da. I mean, that calls out to so many people to just create an instant emotional connection. And it started out as beeps and bloops, and it's just been refined and refined and refined over time.
So building off that, one question I have for you, how much of this is, for lack of a better word, nostalgia? In your opinion, you're hearkening back to the younger, carefree days in which you have these great memories or associations, or life was simpler.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that plays a big part. For example, as a kid, I played a lot of Tales of Symphonia. I played a lot of Fire Emblem. And when I listened to those soundtracks, like the Tales of Symphonia soundtrack is not good. It's fine. Like it does its job, but the Tales series in general does not have good soundtracks. However, because I played that game so much as a kid, when I listened to it, like just pleasant memories flood back into my brain, and therefore I like the track a lot more. Same with Fire Emblem does have a great soundtrack, but the same thing happens.
I mean, it's not bad what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, so much, especially music, it's so ingrained with the context of, what we were doing when we heard it, or that made it memorable.
With game soundtracks in particular, unlike I'd say movie soundtracks to an extent, but with game soundtracks in particular, it's always tied to a moment in which you are having a personal experience, in which you are in control of the player, or at least watching a cutscene. But it potential for personal connection is always there in a way that something from the radio might not be, or even from a movie soundtrack might not be. But that's not the only. You don't just encounter these game tracks in the game. You also encounter them outside the game by looking them up on YouTube, listening to it straight through on Spotify. These are two different experiences, and I'm curious about what your opinions are on that.
I want to untangle something I think you implicitly assumed, and let's delve into that explicitly and see if that aids our conversation.
Sure.
You made an implicit distinction between what we see, what we hear in games and music as a different category. Or what? How are they different?
I don't think that I did. What I was trying to say is that the way that games work is that you are playing them, right? You have that experience. And the music, the video game soundtrack is tied to those individual moments. So unlike something where like I'm listening to a random Van Halen song while I'm driving to work, it's not like I think of that as a soundtrack in my life. It's just noise that I might enjoy the song, but it's just noise. Whereas a video game soundtrack, it's matched up to the moment that you're playing. It's meant to reinforce the experience that you're already having. I think that video game soundtracks have a greater possibility of creating that personal and emotional connection because of the investment that games by design require of the player.
It's more interactive, and I totally agree. And we'll talk more about what we find our favorite and why. And it's going to be, I imagine, for you as well, it's that emotional connection.
Yeah, for sure. Let's return back to what I was making a distinction of. There are two different ways of listening to these soundtracks. One of them is by playing the game. One of them is by looking them up or just listening to them. In your opinion, how does that change how you interface with these tracks?
So I think it changes for two ways. And let's get into them. Playing the game, it's supposed, or at least to me, it should not be the main draw of attention because there's something going on, a battle, a cutscene, whatever. It's more of a complementary, or pun intended, in orchestral arrangement. What's going on with all of these items acting in tandem, in concert? Whereas, at least for me, and I'm interested in your call, and also the audience, when I listen to a soundtrack, when I'm working or I'm on a walk, that's more, I want the direct, more unfettered experience, the link between me and the music. Mm-hmm. Some of the times, the most successful tracks are not the ones I will listen to on their own.
When I'm playing a game, I allow for both possibilities to be in the atmospheric, it's kind of understated, but that can work well. You don't need every town theme to be bombastic in your face, and it can just set a mood. Whereas then you have in higher stakes moments, you have these more bombastic themes, and those tend to be the ones that I like the most. So if I'm looking out for individual songs, I will pick those. Although I will say that typically I just Google a soundtrack of a game and I listen to that. What I do find to be different from my experience of playing it in the game versus listening to it when I'm like reading, for instance, is that it allows you to have repetition. It allows you to listen to these songs again and again and again over the course of days, weeks, months, to you to really understand the intricacies of how that song plays out. It's one thing to hear a pleasant tune while you're playing a game, and maybe you hear it a couple of times, so you start to get to know it. But I think that truly seeing the flow of the soundtrack, understanding the songs, requires you to then extract it from that experience and listen to it on its own terms. Which then also, I think, when you go back to the game, knowing the soundtrack better, that can also enhance your gameplay experience.
And I want to bring up something about looking at this music, qua music, instrumental.
Yeah.
A lot of the bombastic, some memorable parts, what makes them so off the top of my head, the use of, drums, heavy drums, sometimes in the deep, sometimes not in the deep, synth music, electronic, that kind of sounds they create are often very good in the moment in the game. But at least for me, on a personal level, that's what makes me less likely to want to listen to them more unfiltered on its own without the game, when I'm on a walk, on the computer, what say you. So that's something to think about as well. What kind of music do we want to see in games versus not in games?
Yeah, sure. I think that.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good point. Like, I don't like synth music, but there are certainly some songs in like the Trails universe, Zeiss, for instance, that plays off of synth themes. And in that context, I like it. Therefore, I like the song. But something else that I wanted to bring up, kind of playing off of what you had just talked about, I remember that I was driving down from New York to Florida with my family, and my dad needed a break. So I was driving, and the rule is the driver gets to play the soundtrack. And so I was playing some Final Fantasy VII music, some orchestrically remastered stuff. And my grandma looks at me and says, "What is this? This is real music, not like the hip hop stuff that we get nowadays." Because, I'm talking about Sephiroth's theme. I'm not One Winged Angel. I find that some of the most successful video game music is as good or as better or better than some of our more traditionally classical music, because they're playing off of the same instruments, the same ideas, the same music theory, but doing it in a new way, to the point where I can have a personal connection to it because I've played through Final Fantasy VII, and my grandmother can have also a positive experience just by listening to it as a song.
What's your favorite, either soundtrack or song or sample? And one thing also that we've kind of skirted about, calling it a song. A lot of soundtracks don't have lyrics, vocalization. Some do. Do we look at them, the ones that do have lyrics that are sung differently from the more pure instrumental?
I think we definitely do. We'll talk about our favorites after we get through this point, and maybe one other point. But certainly, I think, especially in JRPGs or platformers, games that are primarily instrumental, when a song comes on that is lyrical, that's like calling to the player, pay attention. This is important. It's special. It's one song, maybe two songs of the entire thing are going to have lyrics, unless it's like an opening or something like that. The only exception that I can think of, and I haven't played this game, but a friend of mine says it's really great, is Nier Automata. That soundtrack, I think, is entirely lyrical. And he says it's one of the best soundtracks you could ever listen to. I personally haven't listened to it because when I listen to game soundtracks, it's when I'm doing my reading, and lyrics distract me when I'm reading. So I've just put it to the side. But for the most part, the lyrics in the songs call out to, like, this is a special thing.
Doesn't Persona 5 have a lot of songs?
Yes, it does.
Songs.
Persona 5 does not fit the definition I just gave out. To be fair, that soundtrack is absolute banging, and even you agree with that. So I don't think we mean this as a criticism. But certainly they are using way more lyrics than most RPGs do.
Oh yeah, the one of the main singers for the Ruby soundtracks has a lot of covers of Persona 5, and that's how I got exposed to the soundtrack and then to the game.
One thing that I want to talk about before we get into our favorites, we've kind of skirted around this. One of the ways that people talk about soundtracks is it memorable or non-memorable? Is it forgettable? I think on the face of it, you would say, well, you want a soundtrack to be memorable. I know I certainly do. But you brought up a couple of points that maybe a good soundtrack is forgettable. I want to know what you think about that.
Well, I don't want to use quite the term forgettable, but maybe I should say in the Platonic ideal, it's inextricable from the other elements, from the gameplay, from the combat, from the setting, the characters, whatever. And it functions best as a cohesive conglomerate unit. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you take it out of the setting, something is lost. Whereas some soundtracks, you take it out of the setting and it works fine as an independent unit.
Yeah, sure. One example that's coming to my head is a lot of tavern music, say in World of Warcraft or Skyrim. I'm not listening to that when I'm reading. I'm just not.
No.
However, when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons and I'm at a tavern and my DM puts that on the soundtrack, it fits perfectly well. And in that case, it's a good piece of music. But that is very much setting dependent.
It's contextual, something that we've talked about a number of occasions this episode.
Yeah. All right. Favorite soundtrack. Kevin, I'm going to guess it is related to Fire Emblem.
Fire Emblem Three Houses on a couple levels. One, we got some bangers here. Apex of the World, Gobshadowing Store, Shambhala, Crest of Flames, Edge of Dawn, The Color of Sunrise. Now, I want to focus on these last two, The Edge of Dawn and The Color of Sunrise, how independently they're both awesome together. Some of my favorite music, a lot. It's one of my favorite in any kind. So Edge of Dawn plays on 3 of the 4 routes at the end. Silver Snow, Azure Moon, Verdant Wind. After Edelgard is dead. It's from Edelgard's perspective. The Japanese title is The Maiden of Hreswell. And it's about how ephemeral and transient time is and how happy she is to have this brief moment to be herself, to be with the fellow students at Gaelic Mock Academy, but she knows for her ambitions to be realized, it has to end. She has to start the war, that in these routes in which it plays, it's all for nothing. She loses and she dies. It's a sad ending. And the lyrics are sad. It's all about joyness fades and there's nothing you can do. And it's poignant. The Color of Sunrise plays in the Crimson Flower. That's the post credit. It's a happier arrangement. It's faster, different key. It's in the piano. And the lyrics are not there because her vision is being realized. The professor, Byleth, chose her to have this revolution. She does not fear tomorrow because tomorrow, the edge of dawn that's coming, will not mean the end of this brief happiness, but the start of a new age that she can be with her friends and the people that chose to be with her. And it's absolutely beautiful. In the Japanese title, The Sunrise with You, Tomorrow with You, it cements this idea of togetherness and found family. And it's absolutely amazing when you think about the context it plays in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say, for my I don't have anywhere near the detailed analysis that you do. I mean, you've put how many hours into Fire Emblem Three Houses? Like 400 hours, something like that. So you know the soundtrack very well.
8 or 9 complete run-throughs.
Yeah, that's way too much. But I respect it. I respect it. One might suspect that my favorite soundtrack would come from JRPGs because JRPG is my favorite genre. We are doing a podcast about a JRPG series. But au contraire, mon frère, because I have chosen for my favorite soundtrack, Yoshi's Woolly World for the Wii U, which, for those who don't know, is a 2D side-scroller with 3D graphics in which the entirety of the game is made out of yarn. The people who made the games are literally called Good Feel Games, and the entirety of the experience is just this one small little package of cuteness, of pleasantness, of comfort, of whimsicalness, of just having a good time. And I approached this game when I was going through an incredibly stressful period in my life, doing the A exams, as you well know, Kevin. It can really, I send you down a spiral with the amount of stress that it comes. And yet every single song makes you feel happy. It just creates this little moment of joy in your ear that reminds you that there's a certain childlike innocence that you are still able to achieve, a certain amount of just being able to live in the moment and enjoy. And that's mirrored by the gameplay, because the gameplay is very enjoyable. It's interesting platformer, though not too challenging. And so when I was taking my exams, I listened to the soundtrack, and that's the only way that I managed to actually finish them, was because the music put me in a zen enough place that I could think through the problems rationally and get them all down on paper. There are a lot of other soundtracks that I find superlative. Bug Fables, I Sent You Songs from a Hat in Time, Super Mario Odyssey, of course, Octopath Traveler. There's I could keep naming them. But in terms of a personal connection that I have to say Yoshi's Woolly World.
Yeah, and it's all about the memories that they made in the time of our life, that they were impactful and meaningful for us.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, do you have anything else you want to talk about with soundtracks before we move on to our ending segment, which is completely unrelated?
So I want to ask the audience this question. What's your favorite soundtrack, in a game, RPG, whatever, that whether it's you listen to within the game itself and it's memorable, or you listen to on Spotify or YouTube and it's awesome. Either of the ways that we've talked about, share it with us on Twitter, whatever. Want to hear your thoughts on music, because it's so personal to different people. Everyone will have different taste based on their life circumstances. It's so much more subjective than, this game is good, this game is bad, on a more objective mechanics or progression or whatever. But for music, it's so tied into how we've developed to be who we are and why.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to post about that on Twitter too, so that more people see where they can post. We were both very lucky in that this past week, 2 weeks, we've gotten our hands on the Steam Deck, which is, I think, from now on, where both of us are going to be playing the Trails games, at least for me, until we get to Crossbell. I think for you, it might just be the entire way you play it. So I figured that we should let the audience know our thoughts on this piece of hardware, and I'll let you start us off.
So I played a good amount of Trails in the Sky SC on the Steam Deck, most of Chapter 3. It runs phenomenal. The button layout is great. There's no awkward fiddling between you moving your hands. Frame rate is great. You can play it portable. And I'm really excited for the Steam Deck as a way to get people into a lot of PC exclusive RPGs and especially JRPGs into the non-confined to the laptop, to the gaming desktop, into a more portable experience, like how the Switch has, I think, rejuvenated in a lot of ways the JRPG portable handheld console.
I also love the Steam Deck. I've been playing 2 games on it, Trails in the Sky SC. I played the entirety of Chapter 2 on it, and I've been playing Kuro no Kiseki. I have to say, I was very pleased that it was very easy to get the English patch onto the Steam Deck version of Kuro no Kiseki, because the Steam Deck is essentially, it's a Linux PC. So you have a lot of the same amount of control that you would do on a Windows PC. You just have to open up the internal files, drag and drop some stuff, and then boom, English patch is applied. With Kuro no Kiseki in particular, because we have to remember that this is not running Windows, it is running Linux, and yet most games are made for Windows, so it's running through a compatibility layer. And the compatibility layer is fantastic, but it's not perfect. So some of the text appears a little bit off in Kuro no Kiseki because there's one file that gives the English version an alternative font that looks better, but it does not work on Proton. The game just won't boot if you have it there, so you have to remove it. You can still play it. It's perfectly playable, but the text looks a little bit weird when we're talking about like some menu items. The dialogue itself looks perfectly fine. When it comes to performance, I agree with you. SC, it runs pure 60 frames per second. If the refresh rate of the screen were higher, it would go higher. Like it runs SC perfectly. I got no issues. Kuro no Kiseki, it does not run at 60 frames per second, and I wouldn't expect it to. This is not a machine that I'm playing the latest and greatest games on, unless there's no other option, like with Kuro no Kiseki. And setting it at decently high settings, but 720p, it was ranging in between 20 to 30 frames. Setting it to low settings and doing some upscaling techniques, ASR or something like that, I forget precisely what it is, but that essentially doubled the frame rate to where it regularly now goes between 30 and 50 frames. So it's running good performance, and I was having the same 20 to 30 frame rate on my desktop PC. Of course, on that, I was playing it in 4K. The Steam Deck, I'm not playing it in 4K, so my desktop is still stronger. But this is a way for me to play Kuro no Kiseki at a much smoother frame rate that I wouldn't be able to do on my desktop. So I definitely appreciate that. Something else that I want to talk about with the Steam Deck is that I'm predominantly not playing this portably. I'm a big console gamer. To me, the main appeal of playing my Steam Deck was to integrate it into my console setup. So I bought a $50 dock that gives it 3 USB ports, an Ethernet port, power cable, and an HDMI output. It can support up to 4K 60, but the Steam Deck itself, when you set it to game mode, only goes up to 720p. If you set it to desktop mode, you can make it do 4K, though it looks a little bit weird on the screen. I don't think the margins are right. Game mode 720p looks fine, especially since 720p is exactly, you multiply it by 4, you get to 4K. So it's a perfectly linear upscaling. But that being said, the actual experience of playing the game docked is fantastic. I don't have to worry about power. The perfect controller to use with the Steam Deck is the DualShock 4 or the DualShock 5. I've had absolutely no problems pairing it up, either wirelessly or docked. All the buttons feel great, and the trackpad in the middle works as a mouse for the Steam Deck. So if I want to configure something, I can still sit there and just use the controller. So if you're going to play this docked, I highly recommend picking up a used DualShock 4.
Promo code Trails in the Pod. Get $20 off.
God, I wish that were true. We do not have nearly the viewership for sponsorships.
So I think we had a good discussion of music, of soundtracks, the impressions of the deck. Next Sunday will be chapters 2 and chapter 3 of Trails SC.
I'm looking forward to it, man. I really want to hear your thoughts on. I mean, I'm sure I'll hear your thoughts on the third chapter. I've already been hearing some thoughts, and I have opinions about your opinions that I have been working very hard to not tell you because you need to play through the whole chapter. I don't think you're done with it yet, right?
No, I am just starting the Tea Party quest. I'm in the warehouse in the west part of Gransel.
Okay. You let me know what you think about the end of that chapter.
Will do. Don't forget, let us know your thoughts. What's your favorite, maybe what's your least favorite soundtracks and songs and tracks for video game music? Twitter, Gmail, at Trails in the Pod. We'll post. See you next time. I'm Kevin. That's Colin.
Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next week. Bye bye.